And that's all Jess. So
she'll be excited.
I hope so.
Just be like, hey, here's an audio file that's a little bit better than 2 tin cans and a string. Have fun.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Girls Talk Comics. This is just Erin today, no Jess, but we do have a surprise guest, I suppose. It's our lovely friend who we have affectionately dubbed DoctOra, I think is how we've even said your name a few times on here. Just to
no.
Yeah, you're named.
You summoned me.
Yeah. So DoctOra, just to give a little background, I met you when I started working at the local comic shop.
Does that not feel like an eternity ago now?
It does.
You and I have aged exponentially in the 4 years hence.
I'd like to think we aged like wine, though. So, like expensive wine, not like the Trader Joe's wine that goes bad.
Not like Yellowtail?
Yeah, we are a little bit.
No offense to Yellowtail drinkers,
yeah,
mind you.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fine connoisseur of the box wines as well myself.
If I didn't have a bottle of cheap wine in my apartment, I'd probably it'd be a problem. But Aura, you've been a nerd all your life.
All of it.
Also knew Jess from, gosh, how did you guys even meet?
Oh, that's a complicated story that would take up your whole format here. It's the school is the short answer.
We'll go with the short answer because there's so much about you that we could talk about.
Well, it short circuits from a friend of a friend, through a thing. But
I love that you just collect other people's friends.
Orphans.
That's fair. Yeah, I think you're the prime reason I've met a lot of people. Whenever I moved to town, you're a central hub for most of the people I know.
There was a book I read a long time ago called Urban Tribes, and it talked about social networking in a very rudimentary way that involved hubs and spokes. Mm-hmm. And when I was reading about the hubs, I was like, oh my gosh, like this book understands me.
Yeah, you're definitely a hub. Kind of on, I guess, the reading note, you have your PhD, thus DoctOra, and it's in American Studies, and you focused a lot on the comic industry, specifically, if I remember correctly, and hopefully in a simple way, kind of on how that contracting works on in kind of the job sense.
Yeah,
economics.
I really focused on the work for hire aspect of it. My dissertation in like 2 minutes, right? So real quickly, I guess let me thank you for allowing me into your clubhouse here. I have no business being here, but I appreciate it. My dissertation, how this went down. So I knew that I wanted to do my master's thesis was on orphans, and I did a bunch of textual analysis on orphans in comic books.
Oh.
And I knew that I wanted to do something different for my dissertation because I jokingly said for my master's that everybody in my master's program studied the saddest things, and I didn't want to study sad things. So I went the route of comic books, and my advisor at the time, she spitballed me a couple of things involving comic books that might be interesting, and I ended up picking orphans.
That's also a very sad thing, by the way.
Well, it turned out as I started reading and as I started to get involved, because in order to study fictional orphans, you kind of have to look into real orphans.
A little bit, one would think.
And so I ended up studying the saddest thing, really. And I was like, gosh dang it, I don't want to do that again. I don't want the sad thing. So when I was doing my PhD, I'm like, I'm going to study something more upbeat. I'm going to, do this. And so I started.
So you picked economics.
Well, hang on. It gets there. So I studied. I wanted to do family vacations.
Okay.
And the problem was that the department that accepted me didn't really have a specialist in that or anything even close. I ended up kind of asking around, seeing if somebody would take my project on and got no bites. So the chair of the department, sat me down one day and had the talk with me. And she was like, look, like, we accepted you here because you study comic books, do comic books. And I'm like, man, I don't want to go out on the job market and be the comic book guy. I don't want to pigeonhole myself into this thing. Like, I already did that, and I liked it. It was fun. I know all about it. I don't, and she's like, so do it again. Just do the trick that you do well. And I was like, oh, all right. So what I sat down with it for a couple of months and kind of, decided a number of different things. Among them, I was like, I don't want to do another textual analysis because I did do text already. I want to study people. And so what I really thought I wanted to do at that time was study the printers, like the actual maker, like hands in the ink makers and I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, because the people who print these things are just people who print stuff for a living. Like, they don't care if it's a comic book or a calendar. So I was like, okay, well, never mind. Like, that's not going to work. So, I ended up in the creative side. And when I started to sort of deep dive into the creators, I found this sort of what I perceived of rather as inherent injustice in the industry, which are these work for hire contracts. For the people who don't know what a work for hire contract is, this basically means you create something for somebody else and they pay you a flat fee and they maintain all of the rights and all of the exclusivities on all of it. So if somebody writes, they create a character, whole cloth for Marvel, and this is how Marvel, DC, and several other companies sort of work, is through these work for hire contracts. It ends up such that Marvel and DC end up owning that thing, and you got your, $100 for creating that thing, 8 years ago. So if they end up making $1 billion franchise out of it, you still got your $100. Thank you. Have a nice day. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go into the industry and I'm going to I'm going to be a standard bearer for the little guy. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to write this dissertation, and eventually it's going to become a book, and it's going to expose these injustices and change everything. And then I talked to the people, and what I found out is they know the thing going in. Like, they aren't concerned about it as much as, it would seem on the surface, because they're aware of it, And so my dissertation ended up actually being, you read some of it, I recall. My dissertation ended up actually just being a lot more about people's process after all was said and done, because I didn't really want to, as soon as I sort of figured out, there's injustice here, but it's victimless injustice, if that's a bad way of thinking about it, but it's the creators know what they're doing and they're kind of okay with it because they know that it'll bring greater rewards if they play the game. Now, having said that, there is some amount of just changing the game or changing the system that we could do, but that's another dissertation for another time, not the one that I wrote. The one I wrote ended up being about lives, because what I did figure out was through these work for hire contracts, these comic book people end up being gig economy workers effectively. And so they don't have health insurance. They don't have retirement set up. When you end up, getting sick in the comic book industry, your solution is things like a GoFundMe or raise funds through these various means. That it's really sort of shitty that we. Is that okay on your pod? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it's really cruddy. Sorry, Jess. You have to edit that if you do. It's really cruddy that these people who create all of these things for us end up going in a bad way because they don't have things like health insurance or basic incomes. So that's what my dissertation ended up being about, and less about these unfair contracts in the way that I thought they were unfair.
No, that's still
there you
really
go.
Interesting. It's an interesting topic. Having met some creators and being a little bit more active on social media with the comic world, I see some of these conversations happening. I mean, with Kickstarter really taking off as a creative outlet for a lot of creators. I'm saying creative a lot. That's redundant.
Yeah. Oh man, in the dissertation, like, creative or, that
Some
word probably,
variation.
something on it, like, 1,000 times in the thing, So.
Yeah, I think if I was to really edit the entirety of your paper, I would just be cross-eyed with how many times I would see the word creative. But
yeah. It was a process picking a word about the, those of you who, have written dissertations are probably in the same boat I am. And when you hear me talk about this, you're just like, oh yeah, duh. But people who haven't written them, like picking a sort of word that is the subject you're studying is kind of one of the hard bits of doing it, because like I was like, do I want to talk about them as like creators, which is sort of like inherently political in its own sort of right? Do I want to call them like, something else that I made up? Do I want to call them writers, artists, whatever they are, like, so one of the questions that I asked when I did, because my project ended up being an ethnography, that was the other difference. So when I didn't want to do text, what I then did was an ethnography where I went and I talked to people and studied the people in the thing. The first question I asked them in each thing was, how do you identify in the industry? And, I sort of let them pick, like, okay, do you want to be artist? Do you want to be writer? Do you want to be creator? And that seemed a clunky solution to a problem, but
it's a solution.
Yeah.
It certainly stuck with your idea of wanting to study people. It allows them to kind of take a little bit of ownership. It's almost a rebellion against the work for hire ethic, where you're like, yeah, you get to name who you are and what you do in the industry.
Well, and when you go into these sorts of things, because it's an academic situation, you can't go in knowing what you're going to find. So you do have to have that open mind about it all. And that was, again, that like I said, I thought I was going to go in and change the world, and I ended up, changing my mind, basically. And that's
changed your world.
Yeah, right. It was a good project, and I wanted to do a follow-up to it with regards to the COVID stuff. And I mean, I have started like fits and starts with this particular thing, where I've gone back and I've talked to some of the people I talked to before and said, okay, how are you dealing with COVID now, with like everything that sucks, basically.
Right.
And I've only gotten a scant few replies, I think, because people just don't want to talk about it, or whatever, they're too busy, which is completely understandable. This would be, I sort of jokingly said in the line of the proposal to the project for the COVID part of it, I was like, my old project, even though we didn't know it at the time, is about the best of times. Now let's talk about the same people in the worst of times.
Right.
Because when you get hit with this like medical thing and the industry shutting down for months at a time and people lessening output and no opportunity to market your stuff at conventions and just like all of this, like a confectionery basically of bad things for these people in this industry. So
again, being in the Twitterverse and seeing creators and writers and artists talk about not going to conventions and things, it's actually kind of funny. I think a few of them appreciate it because they're like, great, I don't have to see people. At the same time, they do talk about the loss of advertising, the loss of sales, and just kind of.
So when you talk about particularly artists, a lot of the ways in which they make money off of their thing is go like sketches and things like that at conventions.
Yeah, selling original art too.
Yeah, and so it ends up such that if they don't have the convention, they work for this cruddy rate at Marvel, and that's that. To directly monetize and have that slipped out from under you, like as far as the convention circuit goes, sucks. And I mean, I don't know what they're saying in the Twitterverse at the moment, but the things that I've seen through articles and things, like people have a real fear that conventions are never going to come back. Like this might, because conventions were kind of starting to become a scary proposition anyway because of mass shooters and things. But that seemed like an extreme like possibility, not like a real probability in the way something like COVID ended up being.
I don't know if I can see that. I know conventions, depending on the convention in which city it's in, can bring in a lot of money for an area. Gen Con in Indianapolis, for example, is a huge thing for them. It's a huge convention.
So you have I did like, a tiny amount of research on the convention circuit, so I don't know a ton about this. Okay. But basically, most of the conventions that are large and medium size are run by a very few people. The Wizard World sort of group, and the people who put on San Diego, whose names Reed Pop, and all of those places are all put on these conventions. And without that money, those places are going baroque. So, sure, San Diego Comic-Con will exist in some form. Gen Con will exist in some form. But is it ever going to be 200,000 souls beating down the door like it has been, or is it going to end up being a much more modest thing? And can those companies support that more modest thing? Is a question. It's an open thing. And there, like I said, there are creators that are a little worried about that, because that's a lot of their bread and butter, so to speak.
That's a huge change in the economic environment.
Yeah.
That's a lot to kind of think about. And, I think in our conversation and everything that I see, I think about Kickstarter a lot. I participate in Kickstarters. There's a lot of great stuff, and it's so nice supporting something creator owned and something they're enjoying to the point that they're willing to run a Kickstarter, which I imagine is no fun or easy feat. I mean, the amount of people I've seen do one and then go, okay, I'm taking a week off. I'm away from my computer. Just the effort, even the effort I have to put in to try to get anybody to listen to an episode of this podcast. And I'm not even getting any monetary or reward for it. So it's like super, low, but it just seems like, I guess, that gig component where they just have to do all of this to maintain any kind of...
It's on that hustle. I, as I was talking to some of the creators while I was doing the dissertation, the word hustle came up lots of times.
I bet.
It's a hustle. One of my favorite interviews was with one of the people who was involved in the Rick and Morty comic book.
Oh, yeah?
And I was standing there and, I'm like, hey, I'm doing this project. Do you mind if I interview you? And he's like, oh, no, go right ahead. And I'm like, look, I'm respectful of your time. I realize that, this is where you make money. So I'll get out of the way if, somebody wants to, whatever. And so while I'm standing there, somebody comes up kind of very tentatively looking at because they see the Rick and Morty, and they, when you're at these conventions, you kind of gravitate towards the things you understand. So, that's the attraction. If you want to talk about a good way to do a stand at a convention, make sure you have recognizable things somewhere near you, because that's the things that people will sort of come toward. And so this girl came toward the Rick and Morty stuff, and she's kind of very tentatively looking at it. And, the creator I'm talking to is like, hey, can I interest you in anything? And she's like, my boyfriend really likes Rick and Morty, but I don't know, kind of thing. And he says, he's like, well, you can tell your boyfriend that you almost met the writer that creates the comic book for Rick and Morty. And I was like, oh my, yes.
Yeah.
But it was really one of my favorite interactions, because I was like, oh, you kind of have to be out that way. You kind of have to be. And, in particular with Rick and Morty, it's a little more intense. It's amped up a little bit. But, what I remembered about that sort of encounter was, I was like, you can't be timid and still move product, basically, because when you're right next to 1,000 things at these comic book conventions, your thing only stands out because people recognize it. Mm-hmm. But you only have that split second to catch them, too.
We kind of have to do that in our retail world. I mean, it's just sales.
Sure.
It's just, it's not.
To give these guys, I guess, a little background too. Like, I've been involved in comic book retailing on the other end of it for 11 years now too. So absolutely, there's the way you set up the stand, the way you end cap things. I mean, we jokingly have said, just moving things around the store sometimes, all of a sudden,
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. What just moving a shelf can do or moving a book from. I love watching you clean up the shelves. Like whenever I'm picking up my books and you're there and we step aside so we can just look exhausted away from customers and coworkers. I love watching you move the books around because you'll see a hole. So of course you fill it, but watching you move the trades around that are on the new release section, and you're just like, all right, this one will sell. We need to move this up. This one needs to be here. Move this back here. This
watching me play Tetris with the
yeah, it's a lot of fun, because it does happen. Like when we were working in store together, I would see it happen. So.
Oh, that's instinctual. Like when I'm doing all of that while we're talking, like that doesn't even register as a like front thought in my brain. I'm just like, oh, this needs to be better sellable this way, and that's it. Like
same here though, just because I was at that store on the floor for about 3 years, and I've been working in some form of retail for about 14 now. Comics for only 4. But it just does become instinctual. If you're like, I can't see it, no one else can see it. And half the time you're just like, it has to be visible. I think it's really interesting when you're talking about creators have to push themselves. Like half the purchases in the store are based just on our excitement about a book, or if we can name a book. Yeah, it doesn't even have to be, of course, like Marvel and DC. If you're already reading Marvel and DC, it practically sells itself. Like X-Men readers read X-Men. No ifs, ands, or buts. You don't have to really push hard. But with Image or with the smaller publishers, with some newer DC or Marvel characters and titles, like us just mentioning the name got people to go pick it up and read it, which I thought was really interesting. And
I learned from the shop I worked at before the one I worked with you. The manager there was really interested in what he referred to as taste making. He's like, we are the taste makers. Whatever we're interested in is what we're gonna sell in the store. So this is why if you go into different comic stores, they all kind of have their own personality as well.
Right.
In part because they're not a part of a national chain and they don't have to answer to anybody other than their sole proprietorship. Now, you could argue that as a monopoly or quasi-monopoly, Diamond, has a bit of that mono sort of look about stores. But when you go into each one, it has its own kind of feel to it. And that feel is completely dependent upon its proprietorship, And when you talk about like the differences, and I know you guys have talked about this on your pod before, but, to sort of dip my toe in just for a second, the difference between a welcoming environment and somebody being a gatekeeper or a shitty person behind the counter can really be the difference as to whether or not you're interesting your audience or turning them away, turning them off, turning them down.
Yeah.
And it does make a huge difference. I mean, one of the things that has happened at our shop recently that apparently has also been happening nationwide, but, I didn't know it because I wasn't paying any attention to it, was manga has come back.
I was actually going to say a big change since I was at the store to now the new manager. Our focus was really growing Image whenever I was there because that's what I was eating.
Yep.
And by eating, I mean eating mentally.
Absolutely.
But that was what I was consuming. That was what I was selling to other people. And then I left, and new manager loves the weird stuff too. I respect that about him a lot, but he was really into manga more than I was. And so that's exploded. And I love that also. And so it's great going in there and just seeing and feeling that difference. And I really am excited about what he's done with the store too.
I don't have a business mind. I never have. Mm-hmm. Like that doesn't come instinctual to me in the way it comes to some people. It's one of the reasons why I have jokingly said I want to open up my own shop, but I'd be fucking terrible at it. Oh, I'd be frigging terrible at it. Sorry again, Jess. I was telling somebody the other day, it's easy to gamble with somebody else's money. Mm-hmm. And that's what you kind of have to be when you're in one of these sort of comic store situations. Every owner I've known of a shop has been some sort of gambler of a stripe, and it makes sense. Like that personality makes sense for that. But I'm not that. I've made bad bets. I've seen bad bets and how they pay off, and it would take me one of those before I'd be devastated and I'd just shut it all down immediately and I'd be like, I can't anymore.
I do love watching you do a final order cutoff and just being like, it's the owner's money, it's the owner's money, it's the owner's money.
Oh, well, it's even crazier than that when you get to like the complicated calculus that some of these companies want you to put into ordering their product. God. I mean, I'm sure you've seen me cuss at a final order cutoff more times than you've seen me even just be like, F it,
Yes,
we'll take a gamble on it, and it's not my problem, basically. But more to the point, like, is that where I'm like, okay, I have to order 8 copies of this to get 6 copies of this thing to understand, how many have we sold before? Is there a long tail on this? Because that's a thing that, as somebody who runs the business end of it, I'm really terrible at tracking, which is the long tail on a bunch of books. Is this image title going to sell in 3 months, even though it hasn't sold in month 1 or month 2? Or do I have to just cut it loose and like say, well, it's just going to, live here, because again, like you mentioned, Marvel and DC does have long tail, Yep. There are people who come into the store once, a month, once every other month. They come in and they pick up a stack of Avengers books or Avengers related titles and they leave very happy.
Yes.
But, some indie titles don't have that same luxury, basically.
Right.
Because, again, I don't sell it in month 1 or month 2. An example of this right now that's going on, sorry that I'm naming names here, Commanders in Crisis. I bet big on that book. Like, there was a 1 in 20 cover. I was like, I'm sure we could move 12 copies of this. I'm not sure we could move 20. And, I sort of sat on it for a minute and I was like, well, I like the creative team. The preview art looks good. This is the kind of thing I think we could eventually move, on a longer tail and it'll be okay. 20 copies plus the 1 cover came in and we moved 3.
Oh, no.
Yes. Issue 2 came out, a month later, as you would expect. And because of our ordering process, there was no way of knowing that I wasn't going to sell near 20 copies of issue 1. So I got 15 or 13 copies of issue 2, thinking, okay, this will sell now. This is how, somebody will try issue 1, but not necessarily hop on for issue 2. So you have to cut orders. This is how the industry works, standard. It's called standard attrition. It's standard practice because people are going to try things, but they might not stick with them.
Right.
I usually run about a 75% attrition rate, assuming that 75% of people who try something will stay on for it. And in this case, I like I said, I ran a 13 or 15 copy second book. It sold 2.
Ooh.
Yeah. So I was right, 66% attrition. But now we're stuck with those copies. They're not going anywhere. By issue 3, I knew that we weren't selling it very well, so there was only 4 copies of issue 3 on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
With the idea that, okay, well, maybe we'll long tail 1 person onto this book, obviously, since 3 tried it, basically. But by that time, that's got to be devastating to the creators, because if other shops bet like me, now we're at 20% of what we were for issue 1. By issue 3.
Right.
If they were running their economics a particular way, assuming that it would stay at a particular rate. Now, not everybody, again, runs their shop like I without knowing anything about this book, I bet big thinking it was going to do something, and it didn't. At DC, 3 Jokers did really well for us. That's a book that I actually under-ordered, but through some wizardry behind the scenes, I was able to get some extra copies of. And we ended up moving more than I had anticipated, because our standard at our shop, we can sell 30 copies of an event book at DC, depending on how, whatever. So I said, okay, 35 on 3 Jokers. And we sold through the 35 on the first day. And then I got another, 20 or 30 and sold through those as well. So we ended up moving something ridiculous, like 70 copies of that 3 Jokers business.
That's insane. I also forget that we're actually a big store. Like it surprises me that we are a big comic store.
Sure.
I don't know why. I think it's because I think of like the Barnes and Noble, the massive retail book setting.
Yeah.
And then us. It shocks me, I think, to think that our numbers are kind of a bigger scale, or maybe a medium scale.
I call it medium.
Medium scale. And
yeah.
just, I don't know, the industry is smaller than I think and bigger than I think. And it's just all around impressive to me.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
Well, the industry is small enough that you can meet the people in it, which is another thing, again, in my dissertation. This is unique. Like, if you make TV shows, like if somebody makes a TV show you like, when does it occur to those people, I want to go meet the writer of that TV show?
Right.
You know, and so that makes this industry unique in that way as well.
Ooh, the grander implications for that kind of, it's fun to think about. It's fun to talk about long-term success. You know, Marvel, DC, they have long-term success, but I was just thinking about like the Bloodshot movie or the Invincible TV show that's coming out on Amazon. And, you know, those books have been around for a very, very, very long time.
Sure.
I think some of those have been dollared out in our store before. And the fact that they've now gone on to this kind of success. And so I know Invincible is starting to sell again, if not physically, at least digitally. I've seen people reading it that way. And it's just kind of, to me, unexpected, wonderful, but also unexpected.
I mean, the other media helps in that case. You know, again, if you've got a TV show or a movie in the works, those things getting new life that way. It used to be word of mouth really helped these books, you know, but it's weird because you get, sometimes there's this Twitter echo chamber that will hype up things and that doesn't go anywhere.
Oh, that's that. Yeah.
It's odd because as somebody who studies this stuff and as somebody who's on the retail end, like, it's easy to get sucked in by that. Oh my gosh, I've seen people talking about this book. I think for me, Commanders in Crisis as an example of that. Like, I saw there was hype and I was like, okay, there's hype behind this book. Like, people are interested, and 3 whole people were definitely interested.
3 whole other people were on Twitter.
Yeah, it can happen.
But I did see a lot of us, like when you mentioned word of mouth, it's definitely the retailer word of mouth that I think drives it. Fans find their creators in the comic world. Twitter users, Instagram users, they find the people that they want to look at, they want to talk to, whether it's community members or not. I've seen a lot of the same circles overlapping in the Twitterverse, and they make recommendations to each other back and forth. They all kind of all talk about the same book at the same time because you got to stay current, right? But they also will follow their creators who they already liked. And so they will go ahead and buy the books that creator's coming out with because they already like it. But no one would have read Bitterroot had I not told them about Bitterroot. And I got a lot of people turned on to it because I was the connector between the comic knowledge and the person who had the money. Word of mouth is very powerful when you're in the shop. So it's like,
I think you're right. So one of the things we talk about in my sociology class is this idea of these agents of socialization, the people that affect you, right? The people that integrate you into society and things like that. And relative influence of agents of socialization make a big difference. So one of the things, I say, well, your parents and your peers are the biggest influence on you, right? These are the people who are closest to you, and they're, then the next sort of level of agents of socialization are what I sort of think of as institutions. So, the government telling you what to do, your medical people telling you what to do, like these schools telling you what to do. These people who are institutionally bound, all right?
Yeah.
And then the third layer of agents of socialization is media. And media still has an influence on you, but it's significantly less than these other agents up the chain, basically, right? Because of direct influence. Media is just sort of spitting it out there. Right. I sort of refer to Twitter as somebody on a street corner with a bullhorn. And how much attention are you giving that person with their bullhorn?
Right.
Some people put more credence into some people on some corners or street corners, whereas other people just have dark alleys where they have their bullhorn, but to that extent, I heard somebody screaming about this on the street corner the other day. Versus like you standing in front of them as their quasi friend at the comic shop, letting them know this is the coolest, hottest thing I've read, or just simply, it's not hot, it's not cool, but I enjoyed it.
Right.
You might too.
Yeah.
For a long time, DC had Vertigo, which had perennial sale things. Everybody who came into a comic shop, like, basically had agreed that Fables is a good book.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Fables was hot for a
Why the Last
time.
Man is a good book. Sandman's a good book. Hellblazer's a good book. It depends on what you're looking. And so Vertigo had this real good thing going for a while where it would just constantly move through trade paperbacks and old issues of those various comics. When Vertigo collapsed, I think it hurt DC more than they had anticipated, because having that perennial sales on those books transferred over occasionally to something like an Authority or a Wildcats or something like that then transferred over to Superman and Batman. Some of those audiences didn't realize they were getting sort of short-circuited over to that stuff. But this creator, and you mentioned the creators, right? This creator that was on Hellblazer wrote this cool story in the Authority. Maybe I'll try that. Oh, the Authority is just an adult version of, Superman and Batman. Let me go try Justice League for a minute. This isn't so bad. This isn't as whatever, this isn't as bad to try as I thought it was going to be, because
this is hilarious. Because now I could totally say that Sweet Tooth, which is the comic that I started my reading with, is the reason I read Naomi.
Yeah.
Which, unrelated creative teams, but it was just kind of I picked up a comic about a kid with antlers in a post-apocalyptic setting, and then I read Naomi, who was a new Superman. And she was awesome. And so, dang it, Jeff Lemire, you're the reason I read superhero comics. How dare you?
No, yeah. Well, I mean, people complain about the sort of mono-genreization of comic books. That is to say, all comic books are superhero comic books. But superhero is really just the veneer on top of a drama or a romance or an action book or whatever.
I have a copy of Habibi, which I think is this beautiful novel, and it's this beautiful hardback, but it is in no way a superhero. It's a story. Persepolis, also just a beautiful story that just is in a graphic format. And when people want to talk about comics being about superheroes, I get really sad because they're missing out on this just beautiful range.
I mean, absolutely. There's that stuff too. I'm only dismissive of that stuff because I don't deal with it every day.
That's fair.
Not because I'm dismissive of it because it's bad or because it's whatever, but it's just, we sell one copy of Habibi every, 3 months or something. I sell Superman every day. So I don't, I didn't mean to sort of imply that that's all that exists, because
one
it's not
is a little bit more approachable than the others. Superman,
absolutely,
a little bit more approachable than Habibi. It's
well, you also have price point things, and this is one of the things that if you ever listen to our podcast, you'd hear me complain about regularly, which is the price point problem that I 100% think Marvel has, and DC has picked up the bad habit recently. People aren't going to try a book for almost $20. They just aren't. That is a barrier to entry in this industry. When you have a less intimidating number, like a $12.99 book, I think that works. But Image had those $9.99 trades for a long time. They've since had to dial back on that, I imagine. But the $9.99 trades were all the time. Every one of them, I would buy a copy of and give that book a try. Because I was
many just from that approachable price point. You want me to try a book, and you need to not make it $30.
If you hit me with a $16.99 or a $19.99 book, I'm a little more reluctant. In particular,
it better be a thick boy.
You've heard me complain when I'm doing the orders too. I compare page counts to price points. If it's $30, it better have 300 pages. And if it doesn't, you can't order it because you can't justify it to a customer. I can't sell you a 200-page trade paperback for $30. You're going to look at that and say, well, that's really not enough content for my $1, unless it's like hardcover or fancy or something. But I mean, even then, like, you carry one on the shelf, and when you carry one on the shelf of something, it's hard to restock that in a timely fashion to sell a second one, or remember to, because, like, that's a part of the retailing gig too. We're in the transfer between UCS for DC and Lunar because of all of the business that's been going on behind the scenes there. And so I had decided a couple weeks back, I was like, okay, well, this might be it for our UCS distributor. I should probably pick up everything they have that we need. And so I went through all of the DC trades that, needed restocking and all that stuff. And there were things I was shocked that we didn't have. We don't have any copies of Dark Knight anything in the store. Dark Knight Returns, Dark Knight Strikes Back, Dark Knight Master Race. None of it.
We talked about not having any Batgirl, New 52 also, and we didn't have any, like, Gail Simone Wonder Woman or something.
Yeah.
Like, we had a lot of stuff, or we didn't have a lot of stuff that...
Well, it counts on my crappy memory as the guy who orders that stuff to try and get to it,
Right.
And, none of it's, maliceful. It's just there are so many balls you have to juggle,
so many books.
If I lose Batgirl New 52 in the shuffle, like, the only way I'm going to notice that is if a customer tells me, hey, do you have any of this? And I'm like, oh yeah, we should, and then we don't, and then I'm like, I should order that.
The store has also changed a lot, just for anybody who might be wondering why we local, or wondering why we hadn't noticed that. We finally hit a tipping point where the owner, I think, finally believes that we need to be having more trades in graphic novels versus singles. They do have more profit behind them. They are easier to sell. And I do think some of those older trades are kind of of more interest. The Batgirl New 52 is something I'm just now picking up as a personal example. They're a lot easier to get in people's hands versus issue 4 of a run that was done 4 years ago. So it's also better, I think, for us to have them on hand. And we finally at the store have been able to tip over to that point.
Periodicals sell on Wednesdays and Fridays.
Yeah.
The graphic novels sell the other days, is how I kind of think about it. Like,
that's a good point.
Somebody who comes in on a Tuesday afternoon is probably not a Wednesday warrior. They're not the person they're not the person who wants to be, sort of, and there are lots of readers who are not people who want to be on top of the newest, hottest thing while it's happening. They just want a good read. And so that Tuesday afternoon customer that wants to go hang out at their house and read something quality, you can turn them on to an Image trade, or, an Image run, or an old Vertigo favorite, or whatever.
Fuck, I forgot to ask.
Yeah.
You read comic books. What do you like?
So for me, I started reading when I was 8 years old or so. How did you start in comics? And for me, it was a spinner rack at a grocery store.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. I every time I'd go to the grocery store, like, I'd immediately dart for the spinner rack, and, like, the parents were doing the grocery shopping, and I'd be sitting there, collecting comic books that I wanted, and I'd come up with, like, a stack of 15 of them or something. Oh, I want all these, and they'd be like, okay, you can have like 3, and so I'd have to pick my 3, favorites, and it was all, since I'm 8 years old, it's all based on colors on covers, or, gimmicky sort of,
Yes.
Because I am a product of 90s comic books too. So it's all gimmicky, or who had the most exaggerated artwork or what have you. Then one time I was sick, and my dad, like, took me to a comic book shop to, go get a few comics to read while I was sick. And basically I never went back. Like, why would you go to a spinner rack after you've seen Shangri-La, And so I went to this comic book shop, and at that time, a $20 a week habit was pretty pricey. So, cause each comic was $1.50. So you can sort of figure out the math that I'm getting, that stack of 15 now. And then when I got my first job was down the plaza from the comic store that I shopped at. So on breaks and stuff, I'd end up like going over there in my uniform and being like, I need to get my fix, and I perpetuated the habit because of, proximity basically. And eventually those guys asked if I wanted to work there.
That's awesome.
And I did, but I did end up working there, but I ended up being their Pog guy because Pogs were big, and I didn't know a damn thing about Pogs. It was basically like look it up and price it, or like go. This is where I learned a lot about comics retailing, is going with your gut, because they're like, well, if it looks cooler than something else that's similarly priced, price it a little higher. Go with your gut. And I was like, that's it? And they're like, that's it. And I was like, okay. So like, there's no science to it.
What a magical era. That's the secret to all of this, is there's no science. It's just,
no, there's absolutely no. Yeah. I mean, you can Google around or eBay or whatever, but for the most part, it's going with your gut, unfortunately, for better or worse. And some of it is experience, but some of it is just like, is this going to be the thing? So I ended up working at this shop. When you work at a shop, you get a discount. So this shot my habit through the roof, It used to be a $20 a week habit. Now it's a $20 a week habit plus my, employee discount. And we've jokingly said, working at a store like that is dangerous, because like, whereas a customer can come in there and walk by something a couple of times and have a hard time resisting it, walk by it 10, 15 times a day for weeks, you don't resist that thing at a certain point that you're thinking about. Like, eventually you just sort of give in and get it.
I just had a pop figure because of that, because I've been looking at it for months, and I finally was like,
are you a pop figure person?
Not on purpose. It was a Pokemon one, so at least I kind of separated that out. But Jolteon had been looking at me forever.
I own 3 Funko Pops, and 2 of them were gifts. So like,
congratulations.
Yeah, no, but I also don't have, like, if I had a desk at a job or something like that, I imagine I would be a lot more. So my second-ish job was being the Pog guy at a comic book shop. Then I ended up leaving that store because of personnel sort of conflicts. And I was like, well, whatever, like, that was fun. I did it once. And then I started working at a gas station overnights. And in order to like sort of keep myself awake overnights, I'd buy graphic novels at a different shop. And in talking with those guys at some point, I was like, I hate this gas station. I want to be out of it so bad. They're like, you seem to know a lot about what you're doing. Like, do you want to work here? And I was like, yes, I do. And they're like, well, we can't pay you as well as you used to get paid at the gas station. I was like, I don't care. Like, I spend almost all my paycheck here anyway, so you might as well, So that's how I got the job at the comic shop I worked at for 5 years. That's where I learned a whole lot about retailing, customer service, all of that stuff. And then eventually, like, I had to leave that job because I went away to graduate school. But, chances are if I was still in that town, I would still be working there, so.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to break away from comic shops as someone who is still working for very, very part-time for the same shop you're working at.
Why do I love it, I guess, was the question you asked, which had nothing to do with what I said.
Right.
I love it because I think that for me, reading a comic book creates a unique experience that you can't get in film or animation or anything like that. Okay, an example of this I had once was I was listening to a creator interview once, and he said, look, like, between issues, you have a month to think about the answer to how this was going to come out. I had a couple of days. So the magic for me comes from like the sort of wonder of it all. Where does that alternate reality go, kind of thing? And the cliffhangers at the issue, like, how are they going to paint themselves out, or how are they going to get themselves out of this painted corner that they're in?
Yeah.
Like, and I have a month to think about it, speculate, do all the math, whatever, things like that. For me, that's like, you might have a week with TV shows, or you might have a summer. Like, think of the most awesome cliffhanger you ever had on a TV show over from a season to season. With comic books, you have that every month, sort of.
That's fair. Yeah.
And that's kind of cool. Also, the way in which you develop characters in comics is quite a bit different. You can go tangentially in ways that you can't in sort of more linear media. Mm-hmm. I think, for instance, if you talk about a character like Captain America or Superman, like, these characters are kind of ciphers for whatever, sort of thing people, and that's turned unfortunate sometimes, especially for Captain America. But, to a certain extent, you can find something to relate to or something about these characters that, is good for you. And that character development doesn't happen, if you have a brother on Supernatural or something like that character is kind of fixed. Yeah. I realize there's fan fiction out there and lots of it that can sort of wiggle that fixedness, but comics don't have that, because of the attention span and the memory hole of comic book people. Like, I think that you can sort of unhinge a little bit of that. This is a thing when I did my thesis, what I found out about the orphan stuff, in like how they adjusted the orphan narrative to meet every era of Superman or Batman is completely fascinating. Because really? So when here you go, here's my thesis in 10 minutes, right? I'll be careful. When Batman and Superman first came out, like, a reality of life was orphanages and war orphans and things like that, like the Great Depression era sort of orphans. So this is fresh in people's minds. So when they deal with the orphan narrative and these first sort of things, like, they deal with it head on. They're like, this person's an orphan. They live in an orphanage, and, bad things happen to orphans, like, and, the first comic books are kind of very socially aware in a way that I would say even comic books today have a hard time sort of angling at. Mainstream. Then in the 1950s, you have this stress on, like, these things as commercial products. And one of the ways they kind of had to deal with that was by sort of kowtowing to families. So what you have is Batman and Superman, instead of being these lone orphan vigilantes, end up creating these families around them. Right, their own created families, but so they're no longer orphans, even though they're still orphans.
The found family.
Yeah. I mean, you could look at it as character growth, but you could also look at it as sort of a more insidious kind of like commercialization of that particular thing. In the 1960s, they sort of towed the line a little bit. 1970s, it gets a little darker. 1980s, all of a sudden you're back to, both of these characters being broody orphans again. It's because comics got dark, right? And so, especially Batman, I think less so. Superman still to a certain extent. But one of the things they stressed in the Superman comics, and this is a super fascinating artifact of it. So it used to be, in the first Superman comics, Superman was born on Krypton. They threw him into a rocket. They sent him out into space. He landed in Earth. He landed in Earth, specifically America, right? And this Kansas couple raises him with good Midwestern values. Then in the 1980s, in the 1980s, one of the changes they made to the character was that he was never born on Krypton. He was put into a birthing pod, and then he was officially born when he landed on Earth. Like, he fell out of this sort of clone chamber, or kind of. It's not called that, but like this clone. So he never stepped foot on Krypton in the 80s comics, with the idea of kind of creating this American citizenship for him when he's birthed into America.
That's kind of insidious.
Oh, but it's reflective of its era.
Yeah.
And so this is one of those things that, like, particularly as an adult reader, like, I appreciate about comic books is I'm like, oh man, these are they aren't explicit time capsules, but in some ways they are implicit time capsules.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things about him being, an orphan in the 1980s is that, truthfully, he sort of never knew his parents, He just knew of this place Krypton and he longed for it, but didn't know why. And it's these stories are very, eulogistic, and sappy.
Yeah.
And I think in recent years, they've paid less attention to the orphan stuff. This is one of the things, though, as a reader, that's cool to me is like, again, the character can have development over time that seems sort of monorailed, but is actually quite divergent.
That is, yeah, I guess every time they've reset the universe, it's...
Well, but Marvel's never reset the universe. They just reset with every creative team, So, in the case of Spider-Man, for instance, his orphanage, his parents dying, is much less of a big deal to him than Uncle Ben dying, for instance.
Yeah.
But
or Uncle Aaron.
Oh yeah, when you've got Miles. Yep.
In the movie, at least.
Yeah. No, it's the same. It's kind of the same in comic books a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, divergent paths, right? I mean, it's got a lot the same story to tell, but in different ways. And in that case, you have a divergent. And so that divergence, as somebody who was a philosophy major, in as my undergraduate, it says a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's interesting to me about comic books.
I have always loved your perspective on it because I'm just someone who loves to read stories. The history is interesting, but I do feel very disconnected from it. And that's what I really love about talking to you about comics, because you give such a cool frame that I'm not going to get from every Joe Schmo that I talk to about comics, because you've done such intense, specific research on it. And I love it.
You sit there for 10 years thinking about something before you actually put pen to paper and write it.
That 10 years maybe paid off.
Yeah. Well, it pays off in podcasts and tell the job market that.
Working on selling myself too, but I get it.
I know, I get it. But I've loved comic books for a long time, and the thing about it is, like, my dad always thought I'd outgrow it. He was waiting for the day that I would finally be done with it and move on with my life. And then, at some point it started to pay the bills, and he was like, okay, well, maybe he's not going to move on from it. In a sense, I'm of a generation of people who just refuse to grow up for whatever reason. And we still collect toys and read comic books and watch cartoons and things like that. These very subjective ideas of growing up. But to a certain extent, like, comics grew up with me, so I didn't need to move on.
That's a good point. And I think I have a lot of thoughts that you and I can have off recording.
Well, we can certainly do a follow-up in a year or whatever if you want to.
Definitely. Yeah. But thank you for sharing. And I'm going to cut this off so Jess doesn't have to go through everything. Thanks, Jess. Sorry. This just feels so weird since you're not like Jess, and I haven't recorded with not Jess.
I mean, she's she is an interesting character in the cast, as these things go. So I imagine that recording with her is quite simple.
Oh, it's very straightforward. It's pretty great. You guessed good when you introduced us to each other. So yeah, it's clicked really well.
Well, when Girls Read Comics makes it big and is like $1 million podcast, I want a producer credit. All right.
Of course. That's what this is. That's what this is.